So Pirkei Avot, chapter 117, on the topic of why silence is considered by Shimon ben Gamliel to be better than anything for the body. Why is this? This author goes into the Maharal's interpretation. The Maharal of Prague was a medieval rabbi from Prague, and he writes that there are a number of questions in the Mishnah, but there are ways of understanding why silence is important in the Mishnah. The introduction is very difficult, for why was it necessary to tell us where he grew up? Because it is said here that Rabbi Gamliel grew up among scholars. So why? Why is it that we talk about that? If among scholars that we have to emphasize silence, how much more so everybody else? If we begin by praising silence, why does the Mishnah continue with inquiry and action? It would have been more accurate for the Tana to teach us the value of silence for the person, rather than for the physical body. So why particularly pertaining to the physical body? Why is silence particularly good for the physical body? There are other verses that already speak about the consequences of too much talking, because too much talking can lead to sin. So what does this add to it? Rashi explains that the intention of the introductory sentence was to teach that even scholars of wise things to say are used to behaving in a manner of silence, which is the most appropriate behavior. All the more so is silence appropriate for the average person. The word shtika here is translated as silence, even though it does not do justice. By keeping it when there is nothing to say, that should be obvious. So why do we need to use the word shtika? One of the reasons is that the power of speech is attached to man's physical dimension. Speaking is considered a physical activity, despite its source being in man's spiritual and intellectual dimension, because ultimately everything, but still speaking is a kind of physical dimension. And there are ways in modern psychology we can understand this, but we will defer that for later. The lesson of silence is taught in relation to the physical, as opposed to simply teaching that silence is good for man. The force of man's physical dimension stands in opposition to the force of his seichel, which is intellectual and spiritual dimensions. Seichel is a person's intellect. Speech is the physical activity that is the maximum utilization of man's seichel. So on the one hand, it is the opposite of a person's intellect, but on the other hand, it is the maximum utilization of a person's intellect. It is still, in essence, an activity built on the physical dimension of the human being. It is still very much a physical activity. While he is talking, his physical dimension is activated, and this prevents the complete functioning of his intellectual capacities. For man to operate with the force of his seichel, he must be in a state of silence. It is only when man is led by his seichel that he can avoid mistakes. So one way to understand this using modern psychology is thinking about the dual processing theory. Dual processing theory, endorsed by people like Daniel Kahneman, talks about two systems. There's a fast system and there is a slow system. And the fast system is evolutionarily more ancient. It's more related to our emotions and the physical body. And the slow system is more related to things like the intellect, like mathematics and logic, deliberation, things like that. And so when we're engaging in speaking, we're engaging in the system one process that is very fast. It is in some ways also engaging in system two. Here, it is as if the system 1 is bringing down the system 2, as in a person's intellect is being brought down to system 1 process. In some ways, one can argue that speaking is important and it's absolutely necessary because it can bring that which is in our mind into the physical body, heart, and into your intuitions. However, we continue. We're always taught that we had to disengage the mouth before the brain could begin working. There's a lot of truths to these statements that are justified by modern psychology. The language of the Mishnah is quite precise. It doesn't say that speech is bad. Rather, it is teaching that silence is the best thing for man, due to the limitations of his physical dimension, in order to enable his mind to operate to the maximum of its ability. In some ways, speaking inhibits the mind once again. The physical and spiritual begin as opposing forces within man, and either the spiritual controls the physical or vice versa. Silence enables the spiritual intellectual force of the human being to exert its control, which is actually benefits physical dimension, since it enables his behavior to transcend its animal nature and to reach perfection by serving as a vehicle for the mind. But if man increases his talk, the physical dimension is in control, nullifying the spiritual, intellectual dimension of the human being. So by keeping silent, by not engaging in this physical dimension of a person's life, it enables the intellect, and the intellect is something a bit more quiet, something a bit more calm, something a bit more cool. This is why the voice of a fool is a multitude of words. A wise person's actions are governed by his intellectual, spiritual dimension, and this is of benefit even for the physical dimension. Therefore, there is nothing better for the physical body than its own silence, allowing man's mind to operate. After learning this lesson, however, one might think that the foundation is for man to operate primarily on an mental frame, which would mean that intellectual inquiry is superior to action, which is accomplished through the physical dimension. Therefore, the Tana teaches that it is not intellectual inquiry which is the foundation, ikar, the essence, which literally means the root. Rather, it is action which is the foundation. Only after the foundation has been established, which is done through deeds, can one reach step by step for the higher levels, which are accessed through the seichel, the intellect. It is as if we're saying that a person's actions are important, and it's only through actions that a person can reach higher and higher levels of the intellect. This is the principle of not allowing our knowledge to remain abstract, but ensuring that it is always translated into action. So in some ways, this is saying that our speaking, in a way that's devoid of practical implications, is detrimental. In some ways, our actions can be speech, and our speech can be action. If a person is conversing with colleagues, if a person is teaching a class, these in some ways are translated into action. But there are times when speech accomplishes nothing. Now, this is not satisfactory because they already talked about. There are other verses in the Torah that talks about the emptiness and the harm that can come from excessive speech. So why? Why do we have this emphasis on silence? The final lesson of the Mishnah is that excess talk brings one to sin. While we have been taught that silence is the best thing, allowing the intellect rather than the physical dimension to direct man's behavior, it does not mean speech is a sin. It is certainly legitimate, even if not the highest level, to operate with the force of speech, which mixes the physical and the intellectual. However, if man chooses speech to be the foundation of his activity, he weakens the ability of his mind to govern his behavior, since the mind cannot operate with all its intensity concurrently with a force that conflicts with it. An inadequacy in a person breeds further inadequacies. So excessive speech causes inadequacy and leads to progressive deterioration, which brings with it sin. Now, one can argue that if we make action the fundamental thing, and action is the epitome of physical activity, then why would action not also confer the same kinds of deterioration? And perhaps this has to be understood within the framework of Jewish law, and that the actions that are talked about here are the actions related to mitzvahs, and the speech talked about here are speech that are not related to mitzvahs. The word for sin is chet, the root of which implies inadequacy. The implication of the language excessive speech brings chet is that it creates deficiency in the person, which is the cause and the result of sin, because the person allows himself to be directed by his physical dimension. The verse in Mishlei that teaches that in excess words resides sin means that a person who talks a lot will certainly sin speech, with all the nonsense and irrelevant things he speaks. Our Tana goes beyond that, teaching that in the wake of excessive speech, a person is brought to a state of deficiency that leads others to sin, or leads to other sins. This is the precise explanation of our Mishnah to one who understands, rather than the more general way that others understand it, logical imperative of wisdom. The final paragraph is representative of what the Maharal writes in response to those who are satisfied with what he considers a superficial understanding of lessons of Chazal, where they fail to make distinction ways that similar lessons are taught. See the last paragraph of the Maharal's introduction to Derech Chaim for the most succinct presentation of this idea, which repeats itself frequently in the Maharal's writings.